What if I told you that the most decorated unit in American military history was made up largely of Filipinos, and that their story was quietly buried for nearly 70 years? Not erased completely. Not denied outright. Just overlooked. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on a truth that survived war, racism, politics, and silence. Before we begin, I want to know where you're watching from. Drop your country and city in the comments. And if you believe forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered, take a second to like this video, because the algorithm, just like history, sometimes hides the most important stories. This is not just a war documentary. This is about identity, loyalty, betrayal, and honor delayed. In the smoke and chaos of World War II, when empires collapsed and nations burned, a group of young Filipino men stepped forward under a foreign flag. They fought in jungles, on beaches, in death marches, and behind enemy lines. They endured starvation, torture, and impossible odds. Among the darkest chapters was the march through Bataan, exhaustion, hunger, and brutality under a merciless sun, where survival itself became an act of resistance. They earned more medals per capita than almost any other fighting force. And yet, when the victory parades rolled through American streets, their names were missing from the headlines. How does the most decorated unit become the least remembered? How do heroes become footnotes? For decades, families whispered the truth at kitchen tables while official records gathered dust. Veterans grew old waiting for recognition that never came. Some died believing the world had forgotten them. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. Declassified files, congressional hearings, long overdue ceremonies, and a new generation asking hard questions. Tonight, we uncover what really happened, from the battlefields of Bataan to the halls of Washington. This is the story of courage that refused to fade. The story of promises made and broken. And the story of Filipinos who proved their loyalty in blood, only to have that loyalty tested in peace. To understand how this truth was hidden, we have to travel back to a time when the Philippines was not yet fully sovereign, but a commonwealth under the United States. After the Spanish-American War, the U.S. took control of the islands, promising eventual independence. By 1941, Filipinos were U.S. nationals, serving in the armed forces under American command. When war erupted in the Pacific following the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Philippines became one of the first and fiercest battlegrounds. Japanese forces stormed Luzon with overwhelming numbers. American and Filipino troops stood side by side under General Douglas MacArthur, forming defensive lines as the invasion intensified. Among them were the Philippine Scouts, elite soldiers integrated into the U.S. Army, and thousands of Filipino reservists called into service almost overnight. These were farmers, teachers, dockworkers, and students. They had minimal equipment, outdated rifles, little air support, but they had something else, a fierce determination to defend their homeland. As bombs fell over Manila, Filipino units absorbed the brunt of the invasion. They held defensive lines longer than expected, buying precious time for Allied strategy across the Pacific. The resistance they mounted surprised Japanese commanders who anticipated a quick collapse. Instead, they met stubborn, disciplined fighters who knew every inch of jungle terrain. The defense of Bataan became legendary. Supplies ran low. Food was rationed to near starvation. Malaria and dysentery spread through the ranks. Yet Filipino soldiers continued to hold positions long after hope seemed lost. And when Bataan finally fell, thousands endured the brutal Bataan Death March, a forced trek under the scorching sun where beatings, executions, and exhaustion claimed countless lives. Many of those who survived would later escape, regroup, and fight again as guerrillas. Their war did not end with surrender. It transformed. While American headlines focused largely on mainland losses, the reality in the Philippines was staggering. Filipino soldiers comprised the majority of the defending force in 1941 and 1942. They were not auxiliary. They were not secondary. They were the backbone. Historians estimate that over 250,000 Filipino troops were mobilized under U.S. command. And when formal resistance collapsed, tens of thousands melted into the mountains and jungles to wage one of the most extensive guerrilla campaigns of World War II. These guerrilla fighters sabotaged Japanese supply lines, gathered intelligence for Allied forces, and rescued downed pilots. They transmitted crucial information that shaped American strategy in the Pacific. In many regions, they maintained shadow governments, keeping the idea of freedom alive in occupied territory. When General MacArthur famously declared, "I shall return," it was Filipino fighters who ensured there would still be a network waiting to receive him. They protected coastlines. They mapped enemy positions. They endured reprisals against their families. Villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were burned. Civilians were executed. Yet resistance continued. By the time U.S. forces landed to retake the Philippines in 1944, they were not entering blind. They were stepping into a coordinated resistance movement built and sustained largely by Filipinos. Their contribution was not symbolic, it was strategic. And when liberation came, casualty reports revealed the scale of sacrifice. Filipino military and civilian deaths reached into the hundreds of thousands. Entire communities were devastated. Manila became one of the most destroyed cities of the war. The price paid was enormous, and in the aftermath, many believed recognition would naturally follow. They were wrong. Medals were awarded during and after the war. Unit citations, Silver Stars, Distinguished Service Crosses. The Philippine Scouts became one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history for their size and duration of service. Guerrilla units received commendations for extraordinary bravery. Yet something subtle began to happen in post-war narrative. The spotlight shifted. American victory stories centered predominantly on U.S.-born troops. Hollywood films, textbooks, and commemorations emphasized mainland heroes. Filipino contributions were acknowledged, but often in passing. In 1946, as the Philippines achieved full independence, a devastating blow landed quietly in Washington. The U.S. Congress passed the Rescission Act. With a single piece of legislation, it stripped many Filipino veterans of the benefits promised to them as members of the U.S. Armed Forces. Despite serving under American command, they were reclassified in a way that denied them full veterans' rights. Pensions vanished. Healthcare access disappeared. Recognition was diluted. For men who had fought and bled under the American flag, the decision felt like betrayal. They had answered the call. They had endured captivity and combat. And now, as peace returned, they were told their service would not be honored equally. Protests emerged. Veterans organizations formed. Letters were written to lawmakers. But the political climate of the post-war era prioritized Reconstruction and Cold War strategy over justice for colonial soldiers. The narrative shifted further into obscurity. The most decorated unit, largely Filipino in composition, became a statistic buried in archives. Families kept medals in drawers. Stories were passed down privately. Public memory moved on. Imagine surviving the Bataan Death March. Imagine watching comrades collapse beside you. Imagine returning home after years of occupation, believing your sacrifice would be honored, only to learn that your promised benefits were rescinded. That was the reality for tens of thousands of Filipino veterans. Some immigrated to the United States decades later, working low-wage jobs well into old age because military pensions were denied. Others remained in the Philippines, aging without adequate medical care. Yet they continued to wear their old uniforms on anniversaries. They marched in small parades, carrying quiet pride despite the years. They told their grandchildren stories of jungle firefights and coded radio messages, memories of resistance passed down across generations. Many American families had no idea that their own fathers or grandfathers had relied on intelligence gathered by Filipino guerrillas. The interconnectedness of their sacrifice remained largely untold. Meanwhile, historians began uncovering more documentation. Declassified war reports highlighted the scale of guerrilla coordination. Military archives confirmed commendations that had rarely been publicized. The truth was always there, just scattered. It required persistence to piece together. Activists and scholars began pushing for official acknowledgment. Court cases were filed. Petitions circulated. The veterans, now in their 70s and 80s, refused to let their service be forgotten. They were not asking for charity. They were asking for recognition of a promise made during war. And slowly, the tide began to turn. In the 1990s and early 2000s, momentum grew. Media outlets began revisiting the forgotten chapter of Filipino wartime service, bringing archival footage and long-buried records back into public view. Documentaries featured aging veterans recounting firefights and covert missions, their voices steady but emotional as they described jungle battles and intelligence operations. The story gained emotional power as footage showed frail men saluting a flag that had once denied them benefits, while lawmakers faced increasing pressure to address the injustice of the Rescission Act. In 2009, the U.S. government approved a one-time compensation fund for eligible Filipino veterans. While not equal to full benefits, it marked a symbolic acknowledgment that wrong had been done. Ceremonies were held. Medals were reissued. For many families, it was bittersweet. Some veterans had already passed away. Recognition arrived too late for countless heroes, leaving loved ones to accept honors on their behalf. Yet the narrative began to shift publicly. Schools incorporated more inclusive histories. Researchers highlighted that Filipino units had earned extraordinary numbers of commendations relative to their size. The phrase, "most decorated," resurfaced in academic discussions, and what had been hidden for 70 years entered mainstream awareness, honoring memory, even if it could not restore lost decades. Today, descendants of those fighters carry forward their legacy with pride, standing beside framed wartime photographs and preserved medals that symbolize sacrifice passed down through generations. Museums in both the Philippines and the United States showcase artifacts from the resistance, uniforms, weapons, faded maps, and personal letters displayed under careful light as visitors move quietly through exhibits. Oral history projects preserve interviews before voices fade, recording elderly veterans as they recount memories of jungle battles, coded transmissions, and the long road to recognition. Scholars emphasize that the Pacific War cannot be fully understood without acknowledging Filipino centrality. The defense of Bataan delayed Japanese expansion. Guerrilla networks accelerated Allied victory. Casualty numbers underscore staggering sacrifice. And yet, for generations, these facts rarely reached classrooms. Why? Partly politics, partly racism embedded in mid-20th century policy, partly the overshadowing scale of global conflict. But when we examine service records and citations, a clear picture emerges. Filipino soldiers were not peripheral participants. They were pivotal. The designation of Most Decorated Unit reflects documented commendations and battlefield valor recognized at the time, and its suppression was less overt censorship than narrative marginalization, a quiet fading of emphasis that proved as powerful as erasure. Consider the psychological toll of fighting for recognition after fighting a war. Veterans traveled to Washington with walkers and oxygen tanks, lobbying for acknowledgment, carrying the weight of decades on their shoulders. They testified before committees, voices trembling yet resolute, recounting jungle ambushes, coded radio signals, and comrades buried without markers as lawmakers listened in silence. They described the immediacy of sacrifice, memories of firefights and fallen brothers that time had not erased, even if history books had blurred them. For many lawmakers, these testimonies were revelations long obscured by decades of distance. Media coverage amplified their stories, with newsrooms broadcasting archival footage and interviews that brought forgotten chapters of wartime service back into public view. Younger Filipino Americans organized rallies, bridging generational gaps, while early social media platforms allowed the narrative to spread faster than ever before, reaching audiences far beyond academic journals and family living rooms. The truth, once confined to scattered records and private memories, now reached millions. Each shared article chipped away at decades of silence. And with every ceremony honoring surviving veterans, the weight of history shifted, slowly but unmistakably, toward justice. Yet recognition also raises difficult questions. Why were promises rescinded in the first place? Why did geopolitical strategy outweigh moral obligation, leaving commitments to veterans vulnerable to political calculation? The post-war United States faced immense financial strain and political recalibration, with lawmakers reviewing budgets and rebuilding priorities in a rapidly shifting global landscape. But fiscal explanations cannot fully account for the disparity in treatment between American-born and Filipino troops who served under the same command, wore the same uniforms, and fought in the same battles. Scholars argue that colonial attitudes persisted, subtly influencing legislative decisions, while the Philippines' transition to independence complicated how veterans were officially classified. Legal technicalities overshadowed lived experience, as definitions and policy language carried more weight than the sacrifices etched into memory and scarred into bodies. These complexities do not diminish heroism, they contextualize injustice. Understanding them is crucial to preventing repetition, because history is not only about celebration, it is about accountability. As archives continue to open, more individual stories surface, faded files revealing forgotten names, photographs, and handwritten reports that bring long-buried acts of courage back into the light. Tales emerge of scouts holding defensive lines against impossible odds, entrenched in jungle terrain as smoke and gunfire closed in around them. Guerrilla commanders orchestrated synchronized sabotage missions, coordinating fighters in the shadows and striking supply lines with precision under cover of darkness. Nurses and medics risked execution to treat wounded fighters in hidden camps, while civilians quietly smuggled food and supplies to sustain the resistance. The war effort was collective. Decorations awarded to units represented thousands of intertwined acts of courage. Some medals remain unclaimed, sitting in government storage until relatives come forward to reclaim a legacy. Each medal carries a name, a life, a family altered by war. When we say most decorated, we are speaking of human beings whose bravery was measured not in rhetoric, but in blood and endurance. The power of this story lies not only in injustice corrected but in resilience demonstrated. Despite denial of benefits, many veterans expressed continued pride in their service, standing tall with medals pinned to uniforms that time had worn but not diminished. In quiet moments at home, they carefully preserved their medals and memories, distinguishing between political decisions that disappointed them and the ideals they believed they had defended. They continued to salute the flag and honor fallen comrades, holding firm to principle even when policy had failed them, proving that loyalty is not blind, it is tested. And theirs was tested in both war and peace. From jungle battlefields to decades-long campaigns for recognition, the same determination visible across generations of their lives. Their perseverance influenced broader movements for immigrant and minority veterans' rights, as advocates from diverse backgrounds stood together demanding equal treatment and acknowledgment. Advocacy for Filipino veterans illuminated systemic gaps affecting other marginalized groups, extending their struggle beyond their own generation and transforming personal injustice into lasting civic impact. Modern military historians increasingly cite Filipino contributions as central to Allied success in the Pacific theater, presenting research at academic conferences where panels are dedicated to guerrilla coordination and battlefield strategy. Comparative studies analyze casualty ratios and commendation records, with detailed charts and archival documents reinforcing what veterans had long testified: recognition is no longer anecdotal, it is documented. Oral testimony now stands alongside official military records, as preserved interviews and declassified reports confirm the scale and impact of Filipino resistance efforts. As documentaries, books, and digital platforms amplify these findings, public understanding grows, transforming what was once hidden in footnotes into headline material. Yet vigilance remains necessary. Historical memory can fade again if not actively preserved, requiring continued education, research, and stewardship to ensure the story endures. In Filipino communities worldwide, commemorations blend solemn remembrance with celebration of heritage, as Philippine and American flags are raised side by side in public ceremonies at sunset. Names are read aloud into microphones before gathered families and veterans, each name echoing across attentive crowds in quiet tribute. Younger generations learn that their grandparents were part of a unit whose valor rivaled any in modern warfare, holding framed photographs and medals that connect them to that legacy. Identity is strengthened through truth. Pride replaces obscurity as Americans and Filipinos alike acknowledge their intertwined histories in shared commemorative spaces. This shared recognition fosters reconciliation, transforming a narrative once defined by neglect into one marked by eventual honor and restored dignity. 70 years is a long time for truth to wait. Entire lifetimes passed before official acknowledgment gained traction, and some veterans never saw the recognition they deserve. For many families, honors arrived too late, medals restored and certificates issued only after the men who earned them had already passed on. Yet their legacy persists in declassified files, restored decorations, and renewed storytelling that brings forgotten records back into public view. The phrase, "the most decorated unit was Filipinos," is no longer whispered. It is declared, spoken in lecture halls, documentaries, and public commemorations. And with each retelling, the silence that once surrounded it weakens. History, though delayed, bends toward clarity when persistence meets documentation. So as we close, remember this. Heroism does not expire because politics shift. Valor does not diminish because headlines move on, and the image of a veteran standing at sunset reminds us that courage outlives controversy. Newspapers fade and stories cycle, but the medals earned in sacrifice remain, tangible proof that bravery does not lose meaning with time. If this story moved you, tell us where you're watching from and share your thoughts below. These conversations keep memory alive, connecting viewers across the world in a shared act of remembrance. Like this video if you believe forgotten heroes deserve global recognition. Comment to honor the veterans whose sacrifices shaped history, turning digital spaces into modern memorials. Sometimes, the greatest battles are not only fought on the front lines, but in the fight to remember who truly stood there, as dawn rises over silent fields where history still echoes.